Thanks, Sarah Task, for having me this morning. It's great to be at George Mason. I've never actually been to George Mason before, so I'm delighted to finally have a chance to see it. So let's see. We're going to try to keep on time. May you live in interesting times. And you do. We all do. But most of you more than me, in the sense that you're going to be living in them a lot more. You have more time than I do. This saying is, it's often called an ancient Chinese curse, but there's actually no evidence that anybody in ancient China ever said it. Just one of those things that gets said a lot. But I'm going to try to make the case today that it's not so much a curse as a challenge to all of us, but I think especially young people, not because young people have more responsibility for our current predicament, but arguably probably less than some. You've enjoyed our Earth and the resources it has to offer less time than most of the rest of us. But really, for selfish reasons, you have a selfish interest in living your lives to the fullest, with as much meaning and as much love as you can make, for as long as you can live. So I'll get back to the love in a bit. I suppose that just about anybody who's lived on Earth, say in the last 100 years, has lived in interesting times. Exactly 100 years ago, World War I was breaking out. World War I was a war that really changed, you could say everything. It really changed human and political relations well beyond Europe and the West for time to come, all the time to come. But today, we're in a different situation where we're now changing the non-human world in ways that are far beyond what we've ever done before, and arguably well beyond our capacity to undo these changes. So I would argue that times are only going to get more interesting from here, and that you're going to be part of this. Based on your age and life expectancy, I don't know, Dr. Cabrera was estimating 2100. I think all the people here can hope to live that long. But there's a good chance, based on life expectancy, that most of you here will live to at least, I'd say, 2075 or so. Not me. I wish I could be here with you. Now, Jerry Barney and others who organized the Earth 2100 conference from our task asked me to offer some perspective on the current state of the world to help kick off your weekend of discussions about this, which is something I ought to be able to do, having been president of the World Watch Institute for a few years until I stepped down just recently to take on a research project. And our signature book that we've published since 1984 is called State of the World, and it comes out every year, tries to assess the state of the world. I'm familiar with most of those issues, most of those books, at least particularly the last few. And for me, this was sort of an opportunity to fulfill a fantasy I've long had, to deliver something like a commencement address. I think every person who does public speaking thinks, wouldn't it be fun to go to a university and deliver a commencement address? But it occurred to me that this is a real commencement. In a sense, it's a starting of an education, of a school that could be one of hard knocks, and it's a school in which we're really all students. There are no professors, because there's just so much uncertainty in the world. We all are in a position of learning, and uncertainty is something to keep in mind. For me, it's one of the things that can keep you going when you read about bad news. The reality is we really don't know what's going to happen. It makes life exciting, and it means there's lots of possibilities. In a book called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, the great Zen master Shunryu Suzuki, who died probably just a little bit before most of you were born, wrote that in the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the experts there are few. And the longer I work on environmental sustainability, the more I find myself a beginner rather than an expert. I think that's an appropriate posture for the times we live in. It's a time of many possibilities and not a lot of certainty. And part of this is that the longer that I work on these issues, the more humble I become about what I know, what I understand. It's just not that much. It almost seems to be less as I learn more. And I've come to understand that lots of other people feel very strongly that they know differently than I do, and that I need to respect that and work with that, and I'm probably not going to convince them just by pulling out some of my scientific facts. sometimes it feels there's not much room to have a reasonable discussion about these issues, and yet it's absolutely critical. It gets more critical with time that we learn how to listen, and we learn how to have reasonable conversations with people we disagree with. I think that's one of the biggest challenges we face. Some climate change policy experts associated with the University College London in the United Kingdom just a few weeks ago released a report on communicating climate change, and one of their major recommendations was something that they called a new commitment to self-reflection. I thought it was really interesting. Their main recommendation was in this department, and I'll quote, "Active critical self-reflection and humility should become the evident and habitual way of dealing with the climate discourse on the part of all participants. We need to be vigilant in scrutinizing how we evaluate evidence and judge others. We are all less rational and more rationalizing than we think." And that's a strong statement, arguably a bit of a defensive posture to take in presenting a talk on what's happening to the world, but I'm going to stand by it. To quote Christian scripture, which I don't often do, specifically St. Paul to the Corinthians, "We see through a glass darkly, and while we suffer, I think, tremendously for not peering more carefully and intently than we do through that glass, it remains a dark glass." So that said, let's do some peering. See if I can make this work. I was a teenager, a bit younger than all of you, when this photograph, which Jerry and several others here were certainly going to recall, was on all the front pages of newspapers around the world, covers of news magazines. It was quickly dubbed Earthrise. It was photographed by one of the first Apollo astronauts to circle the moon, and it was snapped on Christmas Eve in 1968. And it quickly gave rise to the sort of phrase that almost became a cliche, that we live on spaceship Earth. This small blue marble wandering through the cosmos. It really jump-started a new perspective on what it means to be an Earthling, to live on Earth. Contrast this watery, cloud-covered blue ball with this ghostly, gray, lifeless landscape that you see in the foreground of this picture. The Earth was obviously finite. It's where you want to live. Very definitely, if you got to be in the universe somewhere, this is a good place to be. But it's very small and it's very finite, and that taught us, I think, something. Local issues like littering in the environment lost some of their allure, and big global issues like the loss of rainforests or the loss of plant and animal species, or even human population, which I'll talk a little bit more about, suddenly became things that people wanted to be working on. Climate change wasn't even really on anybody's radar in a major way at that time, maybe a few scientists. But so it's actually even more remarkable. This shift happened in the late 1960s. Within 16 months of the time this photograph was taken, the first Earth Day was held, which I think is the impetus that in many ways led to our task's work in the Earth 2100 conference. So let's take a closer look at this. So here's planet Earth on Christmas Eve, 1968. This is a planet with 3.6 billion people. That's about half of the number of people that we have today. Its atmosphere contains 324 parts per million carbon dioxide. If you lived here today, Bill McKibben could retire. We wouldn't need 350.org. We would be there, and hopefully we'd be staying there, instead of contending with nearly 400 parts per million CO2 today. On this planet that you see here, thousands of species of plants and animals are growing and creeping and swimming and flying that have long since vanished. This is a photograph of a world that is closer to true sustainability than we are today. Now, of course, even in 1968, we were moving pretty quickly away from sustainability. And let's just define that for a moment, I hope for the benefit of the whole weekend, but certainly for my talk, which is that it's living in the present, as we live now, without undermining the capacity of future generations to live just as decently as we live, ideally more, and more throughout the world, more equitably, which is another key part of this. An activity is sustainable if it can continue indefinitely at its current scale and current pace without in any way undermining the conditions that allow it to operate. And we've been on a dangerous trajectory away from true sustainability for a long time, and we're accelerating along it. Here's a picture, or two pictures really, of unsustainability. This is the Caricera Glacier in the Italian Alps. The top picture was photographed in August of 1933, and the bottom one was filmed in August 2 years ago. Last spring, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, comprising hundreds of the world's top climate scientists, issued its first report in 7 years assessing the overall picture of greenhouse gas emissions and how to mitigate them. The scientists stated, quote, with high confidence, unquote, that if we go another 15 years without dramatically cutting the global emissions total, we have little chance of staying within the possibly safe, and this figure is often exaggerated. We don't know this is safe. This is a glass darkly. It's just possibly safe that to stay within 2 degrees Celsius Celsius above what the world temperature was in pre-industrial times. We need to do this in 15 years. 2 degrees Celsius is 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, 15 years that's no time at all for a slow-moving modern civilization like ours, busily drilling, fracking, and building ever more long-lasting fossil fuel-related infrastructure all over the world. Yet, according to the Interpress Service, not a single national leader, at least when I looked at this a few months ago, maybe it's changed, but I'm dubious, has commented on the IPCC report or its implications for leadership or for governance. And in the real world of politics, just 41 human beings can pretty much make sure nothing of substance happens in a collective international way to deal with this problem. This is 34 senators right here in Washington, D.C. that can block any international treaty, and then even fewer, 7 members of the Central Politburo Standing Party of the Communist Party of China, who can totally control whether China, the largest national polluter in the world of greenhouse gases, takes any action. Just a couple weeks ago, the Australian government killed a carbon tax that was already in effect and already raising revenue and cutting carbon emissions in Australia. And they did this because the Prime Minister had promised to do it and he was elected. And the Wall Street Journal editorialized last week that this was a victory for democracy. This happened because, in fact, the people of Australia didn't like this tax, didn't want this tax to happen. And I hate to say it, I think there's a good chance that the Wall Street Journal was right in this. That if you look at polls, certainly in the United States, definitely in Australia, and I would venture to say, although I'm not an expert on them around the world, you don't see a commitment from the public to actually grapple with this abstract issue that is one of the distant future, and or what appears to be to many people the distant future. You'd think in Australia they'd know better, where they're having record-breaking summers every time we have a record-breaking winter. So it's a time of economic challenge and uncertainty, and now increasingly of violence and danger breaking out in fresh new areas of the world we hadn't even thought we had these problems in, from the Ukraine to the South China Sea. What are the chances that in times like these, when there's violence, there's rapid movements of people, there's economic anxiety and uncertainty, that we can take a look at the way we live and the way it will be affecting ourselves in the future and our own future generations? It's just hard to be really, yes, we're going to do this tomorrow. Climate change isn't even the problem. Climate change is just the most attention-getting and arguably dangerous manifestation of the problem, which is really human overuse of almost every important physical and living system that we rely on. This crept up so gradually in human history that there was never a big aha moment when we could really realize that we were going too far in our own interactions with the planet that's our home. In fact, at the same time that the rapidly growing population of Europe was spilling out all over the world and colonizing it and doing horrible things to other people around the world, various European elites, particularly in the business world, to some extent the religious world, certainly in the world of royalty, were designing economic systems based on the assumption and the premise that the earth and its resources were effectively infinite and could never inhibit either population or economic growth. What's really amazing is that today, 46 years after that Earthrise picture was taken, this is still the dominant paradigm. This is the way the world operates. The assumption is there are no limits. We can grow, and we need to grow as long as we can until, in theory, everybody, and more of everybody every day, lives like Americans do. Only if you pay attention to science, and I can't urge you strongly enough to pay attention to science, are you likely to learn about the many ways that expanding humanity and its expanding uses of the earth and its resources for the more comfortable lives that all of us justifiably seek are risking the planet's limits, are running into the guardrails that are designed to keep us driving safely. So there's climate. The fact that the Earth's surface already absorbs 1 watt more of heat on every square yard of its surface, ocean, and land every minute of the day. 1 watt is about what an old-fashioned incandescent Christmas light bulb is. That may not seem a lot, but when you realize that that's all over the Earth, day and night, on average, 24/7, and that heat is growing, it keeps growing. You don't know what that's going to do, so the climate skeptics are right that the models are just models. We can't say what it's going to do. But it's growing, and it's pretty scary. So we're already about a degree and a half Fahrenheit warmer than we were in before the Industrial Revolution began. That gives us about 2.1 more to go before we're over this 2 degrees Celsius measurement, excuse me for using both scales, but I think you're probably familiar with them. And there are a lot of experts at the World Bank, elsewhere, who have basically issued reports saying it's pretty much already too late. We're gonna go right past that 2 degrees. And what is particularly scary is that nobody's actually coming up with any particular plan as to how we would stop. There's a governmental pledge made in 2009 at the climate conference in Copenhagen to let's stop at 2 degrees. But that's where action stops. We've pledged it. That's about all. And even if climate wasn't changing and sea levels weren't rising, the ocean is getting more acidic all the time, or closer to an acidic state, because carbon dioxide becomes carbonic acid in the oceans, and it turns the oceans more acidic, which basically threatens all marine life. Then there's fresh water, which is former Vice President Al Gore used to like to say is no more abundant today than when Moses was found in the bulrushes. And he's right. About 10,000 cubic miles of rain and snow fall on the world as renewable fresh water every year. When Moses was around, we were probably about 200 million people, maybe less. Today we're 7.2 billion, maybe more, heading toward who knows what. I'm not a great believer in the 9 billion figure for reasons I'll say later. But that 10,000 cubic miles is all each of us can use sustainably every year. The rest we're pulling up from underground, and that's water that was laid down in previous geological epochs. That's not coming back at all. We're using that water so intensively that by the latter half of this century, probably half of the world's population will be dealing with water stress and water scarcity. Already quite a lot of them do. About 1/5 of our current food production is based on water use that isn't sustainable, pulling water up from underground that isn't being replaced. So imagine if our goal were to immediately place food production on a water sustainable path. Let's have sustainable food production, including water. Right away, 20% less food to feed humanity. Then there's biodiversity. We don't know how many species we're kicking off the planet, in part because we don't know how many species we have living with us, our only companions in the universe on the planet. But there's not much doubt by any biologists, Tom Lovejoy will be speaking later, would be able to verify this, I'm pretty confident, that it's hundreds of times more than the background rate of extinction before humanity arrived. And this is the biggest reason that scientists talk about the Anthropocene or the Anthropocene. I'm not quite sure how we pronounce it these days, but this is this geological epoch that represents the fact that humanity is now the biggest force on our planet affecting the geological and biological fate of the planet, so that thousands or millions of years from now, future geologists, if we're lucky enough to have future geologists, will be able to see this layer on the Earth's, in the soil pattern, the rock pattern that says, yeah, that's where people really were overdoing it. It's a pretty scary thought. And when you talk to people who study tigers or rhinos, polar bears, pandas, you get this clear sense from them they're desperately trying to find hope that the animals that they love and they care about are going to be around at the end of their own lifetimes. And if they aren't around at the end of their own lifetimes, they're not going to live long in zoos, and all of our efforts to conserve them or to somehow save their genes and inject them somewhere else and grow them again, it's not realistic. We don't really know how to do that. And those are just the iconic fauna. Then there's the amphibians and the salamanders and the bats, fully 1/8 of the world's bird species that are threatened with extinction. Who knows how many insects and other arthropods, and I haven't even mentioned the plants. So these are problems of limits and human collision with natural systems that have long been studied. But there are new ones all the time, too, that weren't around when World Watch started or weren't really considered to be issues or thought about. And even when I began later to really look at these issues, are now among the biggest problems that we're facing and worrying about. One of them is plastics. When that picture was taken of the Earth rising over the moon, the hottest movie in movie theaters was The Graduate. I don't know if any of you have seen it on DVDs or Netflix, but The Graduate, Dustin Hoffman, and the big sexy word he heard at a cocktail party he was at was that he was just graduated from college and he was told, you should go into plastics. Plastics are the future of the world. Well, they became the future of the world. And now there are these massive swirling gyres of discarded plastic all over the oceans, particularly in the Pacific Ocean. And they're basically choking birds and fish, and they're breaking into little tiny nanoparticles and getting basically absorbed by the living things in the oceans with effects we don't even know what they are. I was in Kenya about 4 or 5 years ago on a very remote beach in a kind of a marine protected area in Kenya. And I went walking on the beach one night, about midnight. I couldn't sleep. There was a full moon out. And this beach, which was a lovely white sand beach inherently, had this kind of ghostly blue color to it. And the reason was that it was covered with pieces of flip-flops, little tiny bits of water, plastic water bottles, and the tiny little waving shreds of plastic bags. And these apparently are collected by this gyre and deposited in Kenya from South Asia, Southeast Asia, and thousands of boats that are basically chucking their waste overboard. So plastics, no longer the future. We need to do something about plastics. Phosphorus. Now, phosphorus is one of these elements that you studied in a chemistry class in high school and then kind of forgot about. Well, it turns out phosphorus is the source of, it's an element, it's the source of phosphates in our food. It's one of the 3 ingredients that absolutely is essential to growing food and to keeping us alive. And unlike nitrogen, which is endlessly recyclable and which we have too much of because of human activity, and potassium, which is pretty abundant in the Earth's crust, phosphorus is not. Phosphorus only can be mined in a few places. And we're busily peeing and pooping it out from our food, the food that we ingest, into the rivers and the oceans where we'll never be able to rescue it. And we're running out. The estimates are staggering. The estimates of what's left and the rate it's being produced and the growth that it's being produced at to feed the world's growing population and end our growing taste for meat is that as early as 2030, which I think is about 16 years away, there could be a peak production and that prices could go up immediately and the damage of mining phosphorus would go up. Think of the effect that would have on food. So I want to be very clear about this. No scientist who studies these problems, these disappearing species, these unraveling ecosystems, and these rising commodity prices, has any doubt about what the root cause of this entire predicament is. Humanity is pushing past the limits of the planet. Nature is dynamic. What nature does is it wiggles. Nature has these cycles. It goes like this. But nature isn't designed in a way that it's continually expanding its impact on its own feedback mechanisms. That's humanity. That's a very different system. It's not accurate to say, we're just part of nature. Nature's always changing. Climate's always changing. We're changing climate. It's no big deal. This happens all the time. No, it does not happen all the time. It's unique to our species and it's unique to our time. Even resilient nature, and nature can be very, very resilient, is changing utterly and unalterably. We're growing in number, we're growing in affluence, and that double whammy, when maybe a triple whammy if you add the incredible technology we're developing to alter nature, is changing the earth and threatening its capacity to provide a decent home for all of us. Now, national governments have paid lip service to this for a number of years, at least since 1972. UN gathering, but almost no government in the world is actually willing to contemplate how the growth of our population and the growth of our economies might have to be rethought or redirected to accommodate equitable human well-being in the context of the realities of a finite planet. There's this process going on right now that is called the Sustainable Development Goals. The UN is working on these. You may have heard about it. And they've got the word sustainable in it, but the developing countries are worried that if you take sustainability seriously, that's going to limit their development potential. And the rich countries are worried that if you take sustainability seriously, that might mean that some of us who are using a bit more of the resources of the world than other people might have to be responsible for sort of compensating those who can't. And that's exactly where we should be at. We should be dealing with that question, but instead we're not. And actually, there's very little of sustainability that's being put into these goals. So is there hope? Yeah, of course there's hope. Where there's life, there's hope. There's lots of good things, and I'm running out of time, so I can't go into the detail about the good things that I've gone into and the bad things. So I'll just have to assume that in 2 weeks you're going to get a lot of those. But certainly more people are aware of the problems than ever before. You all are. You're here this morning. Tens of thousands of nonprofit, non-governmental groups like our task, like the World Watch Institute, are emerging all over the world in developing countries as well as developed to start to deal with these problems. Renewable energy is growing much more rapidly than carbon-based energy and nuclear energy, although from a smaller base. Forests are recovering in a lot of places. Fisheries are recovering in some places, partly because of efforts of fishers themselves to keep these resources going and sustainable. There's a growing awareness of the problem and the predicament and how we've got to deal with it by actually reducing our demand on systems that can't increase their supply. So here's the scariest part, but also the most hopeful part of it. The number of us on the planet. Now, when I was born, there were about 2.5 billion people on the planet, which was more than twice what there had been around the early 19th century when we first passed 1 billion and really began to start this process. I mean, who knows when it began, but really accelerate the process of affecting the Earth. But 2.5, that's almost a third, barely more than a third of what we have today. There are 80 million more people every year. And you can say, well, the numbers don't matter. It's really the wealthy among us who are causing the problems. There's some truth to that, but the numbers do matter. Don't kid yourselves. For one thing, the wealthy continue to grow. There are more wealthy people all the time, and wealthy people have children. There are very few countries that are having a declining population. But the good news is that fertility, the average number of children that the average woman has in her lifetime, is half what it was in 1960, and it's still going down. And yet still, almost half of pregnancies are not intended. So if we got to a point where we were increasing the capacity of intentionality of parenting around the world. This may not sound like an environmental issue, but it's a profoundly environmental issue. If we raise the status of women, if we raise the capacity to become a parent when you wanted to become a parent, I won't say this problem would go away, but I don't think we'd ever reach the 9 billion that we're worried about facing today. And I think that this issue of population and its relation to natural resources is one that we're still not quite grappling with. We're still nervous about how to talk about this issue. It's something that affects places like Somalia and the Central African Republic and northern Nigeria, where we see serious problems. It's part of, as Jerry mentioned, part of the reason that boatloads, overloaded boats of African young people are traversing the Mediterranean to try to get to Italy, and that young unaccompanied children are crossing the border of the United States today saying, please take me in. You don't want to simplify these things. There are lots of reasons that they're happening. There are lots of blame to go around, but certainly the fact that these are all nations that are growing very, very rapidly and where women have very little access to the means and the tools of empowering their own lives and deciding when to have children, it can't be a coincidence. So what are the good things that are happening? Well, I think one of the good things that are happening is that companies, you're going to wonder, what's this slide about? companies, probably more than governments, a lot of them around the world. Moms is a really good example, and thanks to Moms for co-sponsoring this conference and providing the really good breakfast. We got organic, I might point out. If we are what we eat, I am Moms. My wife and I shop there all the time. That's not a plug, but they're a great company, and they're emblematic of what's happening with a lot of companies, which is they're getting serious about this issue and thinking about how to deal with it. Now, a lot of them are basically just using it to market their products, to claim that they're ahead of the curve. I mean, I venture to say that Ferrari is not exactly obsessed with sustainability, but this is a billboard I happened to photograph when I was in China not too long ago. So I think one of the tests is when you look at companies that are using what I call sustainababble to market their products, is to ask yourself, are they actually trying to change the system, or are they just trying to market their products? So a number of companies, some of them are called benefit corporations, that actually put into their charter that they want to benefit the environment and their communities. You know, they're actually pushing for change. A number of them are protesting the Keystone Pipeline. These are companies. They're trying to work with governments to change, and I think that's what we want to look for, but that's one of the more positive things. I don't want to go on much further because I think I'm about almost out of my time. I think it's an interesting sign about our times that, in a kind of a weird way, that you're starting to see people talking about leaving Earth. This is something that Dr. Cabrera mentioned. You know, that we can't really leave Earth, but a lot of people are starting to think about it, or to live in odd places. Here's an ad for, you know, maybe we ought to see if we can't build skyscrapers under the oceans. The head of NASA wants to raise $500 million to be, no, it was $500 billion. Let me see if I have this right. A few $100 billion to relax radiation standards for astronauts so we can send people to Mars and become what he calls a multi-planet species. Now, good luck with that. There's one idea. Then there's this Mars One company. Have you heard about this company? In the Netherlands, actually. I've met a young woman from the Netherlands today. There's a Dutch company that has this idea called Mars One. You can all apply for this. They're taking applications. They're going to send a group of humans to Mars in 2022. That's their plan. They've got $6 billion to do this. And here's the catch. You got to be ready for this. There's no return trip. They're not imagining how you bring anybody back. You go to Mars, that's it. Have fun in Mars. Hopefully there'll be a cemetery there waiting for you when you die. And the CEO of this company, I can't remember his name, was asked, you know, you're investing $6 billion in getting people to Mars. Don't you think that money could be well used on Earth? And he had a great quote. I love it. He says, I don't have a business case to solve the problems on Earth, but I've got a really good business case to get humans on Mars. Well, you can forget about these elaborate fantasies of escape. I think if you remember the first picture that we opened with, you know that we're never going to live under the sea. We're never going to live on Mars, because when push comes to shove, as Dr. Cabrera said, there's no place like home. It's the place where we live. And the reality of living under the sea is this. If you live under the sea, you're basically swimming in green algae that's growing up in all the nitrogen-polluted waters of around the planet. But that doesn't mean that we can't get going. It means there's a lot of things we can do. My own feeling is, and I think people can disagree with this, and people can go for, I think there are multiple directions you can take, and one of my sort of parting messages to you as you begin the weekend is that it is an exciting time because there's so many doors through which you can enter these sets of issues and have a positive impact on them. I myself am pretty skeptical about the technological solutions that are bandied about to solve our problems. Geoengineering to deal with climate change. Synthetic biology is one of the newest ideas. Well, okay, we're losing lots of species, but you know, we now have the means to design species that will be useful to humans. This Stuart Brand idea, Stuart Brand was one of the big 60s guys. He published the Whole Earth Catalog, and he has said, we are as gods and need to learn to act as gods because we're now running the planet. Well, if we had the wisdom of gods, I think, or God, it might not be a bad idea, but I don't think we have the wisdom. I think with geoengineering, synthetic biology, some of these things, the problem is we don't know what the hell we're doing, and the problems we unleash are probably going to be just as bad as the ones that we've left behind. So I tend to think that that we face a discontinuity in the future. Discontinuity is kind of a soft, gray, bland word. What does that mean? It means we're going to really need to focus on how we deal with each other. I think one of the more interesting things that you have to think about when you're interested in the environment is that while you can't not work on the environment, if you care about your life, if you care about your future, I think you have to be thinking about the environment. If you're not, you're either not paying attention or you're just completely misanthropic. But the real work, and I think environmentalists are recognizing this more and more, is going to be the toughest work and the most necessary work of all is going to be in the social sphere. It's going to be learning how we deal with poverty, learning how we deal with inequity, learning how we deal with the fact that we are a very diverse world and we're increasingly all living together with people of many different backgrounds, many different colors. We need to learn how to talk to each other. We need to learn how to listen. And we need to work through our differences. And we're coming to a time where, and this is one of the exciting things about the time we live in, I think, we're going to be forced to learn how to love one another. Because if we don't learn how to love one another, we're going to be thrown overboard in a sea of troubles with our hands shackled to each other like we were a bunch of prisoners or enslaved people going from Africa to America with manacles connecting all of our limbs, and we're not going to survive. We're going to have to learn how to survive together through some tough times. So I guess what I would like to leave you with is to think about this as a challenge, not as a curse, to be intentional, to be aware. I believe strongly that one of the most important things for environmentalists to do is think about whether and to what extent they have a spiritual path of some kind, a way to approach the fact that we all know where we're headed. There's no way out of this earth except one, and we're all going there no matter what happens to the planet. So what do we do with the fact that our lives are impermanent? Even as young as you all are, you just really have a few years to enjoy this incredibly beautiful planet. Are we going to be grateful for how beautiful the planet is, for the real possibility that it could stay beautiful for a long time to come, and also the real possibility that a planet like a living being maybe has its own life cycle and maybe is not going to last forever, and we have to deal with that fact? We each need to find those answers inside ourselves, and I think look around us at the people that we're with, the people we care about, be on our best behavior. I'm not always good at that myself, but try and keep trying no matter how you fall short of your goals in that regard. Learn how to live together, learn how to love one another as long as you can, and enjoy this beautiful world and be grateful to whoever or whatever it is you feel you should be grateful for the fact that you're here right now. Have fun. I wish I could be with you the whole weekend, but enjoy yourselves.